Welcome to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
I'm Shannon Lawrence.
And I'm MB Partlow.
Quick content warning before we get started. This podcast may contain language and disturbing content, so enter at your own risk. Hello! We are here on Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem, and we actually have a guest today. I know it's been a while. It's been a couple months at least.
It's very exciting because it's a very cool guest.
And a friend of ours. So we have Sue Mitchell. And why don't you go ahead, hi, and introduce yourself. Tell us a little about what you do.
Awesome. I'm Susan Mitchell. I go way back with these wonderful, wonderful ladies of the podcast. We're all writers, and we met through another organization, Pikes Peak Writers. And I lived in Colorado Springs for quite a while, but I'm currently based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'm a writer and television producer. And I'm currently working on a mystery that has kind of some roots in some local cases. And I've always had an interest in things that are kind of supernatural and weird. And I'm really into true crime. So this is a really good fit. And I'm excited to be on this podcast and chat with these wonderful women about these topics.
We've survived many a conference together.
Yes, we have.
And ever so much more. And Pikes Peak Writers.
And actually, if anybody listening is interested, the three of us will be at Pikes Peak Writers Conference at the end of this month. So
that's right. Some of the workshops will be available online.
Yes.
I still have no idea which one of mine are because I haven't gone back and looked.
I think only one of mine is. So it can't be the one, unless it's the one we're doing together. I don't think that one is.
I don't think so. How many workshops do you have, Sue?
I believe I'm doing 2.
Okay. So I have to ask, because I saw you went to the horror themed restaurant. Is that in Albuquerque?
It is. Me and Bill, my husband, went to a new restaurant called Blood Sausage in Albuquerque. It is an 80s themed horror restaurant. And I mean, the decor is all there. There's a Jason, right when you walk in, Jason Voorhees with a huge machete. There's Freddy. When you order your food and drinks, you get a haunted VHS tape that shakes and rattles when your food's up. It's really wild. They have lots of drinks, real chef-driven menu. Bill was brave and tried blood sausage. He had black pudding, which is not totally my bag. I went for some hot chicken. We had some amazing truffle fries. It was a really cool experience. And if you're in Albuquerque, you should definitely check it out.
Yeah, I know. I was like, how far is Albuquerque from my cabin? But I think it's pretty far. But there's apparently 2 horror themed restaurants now in Denver. I haven't made it to either one yet. Yeah, I saw there's some cafe that has a horror themed menu at the very least. So I haven't checked that out yet. I just found it just online. It was one of those things that, I don't know, popped up somehow on the feed.
I'm writing it down because I'm like, why the hell haven't we been there?
The one opened during the pandemic.
Oh, that was more of a bar, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more of a bar. And then I heard a bunch of stuff about problematic with employees and stuff, and I just skipped it for a bit. But I haven't heard anything else about it. So now I can look it up and go. All right. You want to, I guess we could go ahead and get started, launch in there because we have plenty to talk about on that. And we have kind of a theme going today.
We kind of do.
Inspired by the theme or the story that Sue suggested that she wanted to do.
Yes.
So I am doing The Stolen Children of Nigeria. And my sources are the United States Institute of Peace, Wikipedia, CNN, the Sydney Morning Herald, the New York Times, and Romper. And one of the weirdest things that I keep finding is that the real press has less information than I don't know what we would call it, the weird websites that gather all like Romper. Like some of these sites that are not actual journalism sites have more information and better articles than the actual press these days. So that's interesting. All right. So to start, I need to define Boko Haram, the group who started the mass kidnappings in Nigeria. And I will be starting with a story that'll be familiar to people, but it is much, much bigger than I expected when I started looking into it, as happens so often. So they're not the only ones doing it anymore. There's a bunch of copycats now, but they're the ones who started this trend. So from the United States Institute of Peace, quote, the group Jama'atu al-Sunnah wal Jihad, known the world over as Boko Haram, is an extremist Islamic sect in Nigeria that has created havoc across the north of the country and in the capital, Abuja. Boko Haram feels the government of Nigeria is being run by false Muslims. They especially take issue with education, particularly women being educated, but they feel that it's all been westernized and takes away from their Muslim beliefs. Among other things, the ultimate goal of the sect is to overthrow the government and rule by Sharia law. According to Wikipedia, since the insurgency started in 2009, Boko Haram has killed tens of thousands of people in frequent attacks against the police, armed forces, and civilians. It has resulted in the deaths of more than 300,000 children and displaced 2.3 million from their homes, and was during part of the mid-2010s the world's deadliest terror group, according to the Global Terrorism Index. They've also contributed to regional food crises and famines. I'm going to jump around now. Here's where I said I'm going to start with the story that people will be most familiar with. On April 14th, 2014, Boko Haram members dressed as Nigerian armed forces broke into the government girls' secondary school in Chibok, Borno State, Nigeria. Real armed forces and police tried to stop the attack, but were outnumbered. One police officer and one soldier were killed. It appears, now this was kind of mixed everywhere, it appears the attack was originally intended not to take the girls, but to steal a piece of machinery that was at the school. It may be that they thought the girls weren't supposed to be there because the school had actually been closed for 4 weeks due to degrading security. So they had a bunch of stuff they had to fix up at the school, but these girls were from several schools and they'd come to take physics finals for the senior secondary certificate exam. There were 530 girls registered. And numbers vary greatly for how many were taken, but the final accepted number given by Nigerian police was 276 taken by this group. They were all between the ages of 16 to 18 and were seniors. Now, it actually took weeks for them to know how many girls were taken because they were contacting the parents, and then they claimed in the press the parents weren't cooperating because they were asking for them to say who hadn't come home, basically. But 276 is the number that is most often cited. The soldiers, not sure what to do with the girls they found there, took them, loaded as many as they could into trucks. Then they made the others walk by foot until more trucks could come in and pick them up. It was thought that they were then split up and taken into the Kanduga area of Sambisa Forest, areas around Lake Chad and the Gorsi Mountains. 57 girls were able to jump from the trucks at various parts along the route and escape, which, good for them. 57, that's a lot.
That is.
So that number 276, by the way, that's not counting those 57 girls. That's how many then were kept. It later turned out that the Nigerian government had been notified 4 hours in advance that this attack was going to occur. Yet they didn't send reinforcements to the area. Amnesty International condemned them for this, and the military stated their forces were already overextended, so they simply hadn't been able to mobilize reinforcements. And I was like, but you didn't think to call the military that was already stationed there and say, hey, why don't you go get the girls and take them out of the school? How hard would that have been? Let them steal a piece of machinery. Who cares?
Cancel the exams.
Yeah. So the thing that amazes me, though, is that this entire thing that became a trend all started due to a mistake, right? A fluke, that the girls weren't supposed to be there and they broke in to steal something. Then they just took girls instead, because honestly, they have no value there in a lot of ways to these types of people. So parents, Chibok villagers, volunteers, vigilantes, and the Nigerian military searched for weeks. Some neighboring villagers helped by reporting sightings of the girls, while others returned escaped girls back to Boko Haram. The governments of Canada, China, France, Israel, the UK, and the US all continued to offer various forms of help. After both Americans and the British Royal Air Force located survivors, the Nigerian government did nothing. And when the US and UK offered help, they said, no, it's a Nigerian issue. We'll take care of it. So they wouldn't let, for example, the RAF had located a bunch of them, and they said, we'll go in and get them. Can we go in and get them? And the Nigerian government said no. International attention and protests occurred. We've all heard hashtag bring back our girls. And the president at the time, his name was Goodluck Jonathan. And hashtag bring back our girls was created by an attorney in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. Ibrahim M. Abdullahi first tweeted it in April 2014 to bring attention to the issue, and it was quickly taken up by the rest of the world. And then it became kind of a protest, and it just grew. Before I say more about the Chibok girls, I wanted to jump back in time now. Here's where I go back. Boko Haram had been mostly perpetrating bombings on government buildings, police and military targets, mosques and churches, that sort of thing. They also attacked a clinic to kill polio vaccinators. But in 2013, they perpetrated the Baga massacre, killing dozens and destroying hundreds of homes and businesses. That same year, the Kandunga mosque shooting resulted in 44 dead. Then we had 2014. In January, a car bombing in Maiduguri killed 17. On February 25th, the Buniyadi massacre occurred. 59 boys were burned alive, locked in their school dormitories at the federal government college in Buniyadi, Yobe. The boys were ages 11 to 18. Some children did escape the fire, but most of those who got out of the fire were shot or stabbed to death because they were surrounded.
So they don't really want anybody to be educated.
They do not. But they really, but again, that's because they think their education is westernized. So it's not they think boys should be uneducated, it's that they think they shouldn't be educated in that way. But the girls, they don't want educated at all. Girls at the school were either kidnapped or told they would be killed if they didn't leave school and get married. So we're caught back up because Chibok is the next thing that happened. May 5th was a busy day for Boko Haram. Abu Bakr Shekau, the man considered the Boko Haram leader, who it appears is alive to this day, released a video in the afternoon saying they had kidnapped the girls and that Allah had told him to sell them. The going price for the girls was 2,000 naira or $6. That's what they were worth, $6, and it was something like 4 pounds.
Wait, for all of them together or individually?
Per girl. So yeah. He said the girls should never have been in the school and that they should have been married off and that was legal starting at age 9. Also that day, Boko Haram waited for the local officials to leave the town of Gamboro Nagala in their ongoing search for the kidnapped girls. And while they were gone, they attacked the town and killed about 300 residents. May 6th, they kidnapped 8 younger girls, 8 to 12 years old. So I'm going to be going through some various dates and things they do. I need people to know that I cut there were so many things I left out and I tried to keep the most relevant attacks, but just know that their onslaught was constant. There are so many incidents from small ones where just a few people were killed or taken, and there were abductions happening all over the place. The reason, say, Chibok and some other I'll bring up are a big deal is because of the mass, the bulk, how many girls they got in that taking, and boys. About a week later, a video was released, this time showing 130 of the missing girls dressed in hijabs and chadors. Shekau said some had been converted from Christianity to Islam. He said he would keep the girls until his people were released from prison. He said a bunch more, but that was the gist of it. May 13th, Boko Haram attacked a Nigerian military convoy out searching near Chibok. 12 soldiers were killed, which led to a mutiny by military forces at Maiduguri. The Nigerian army was now stretched even tighter than before. The military were tired of being attacked, and so people were bailing. May 26th, the Nigerian chief of staff said they'd located the girls but could not attack without significant collateral damage. Nothing more was done. May 27th, police, military, and civilians were murdered in an attack in Buniyadi. May 30th, a civilian militia found 2 of the girls tied to trees in northeastern Nigeria. They had been raped and were described as half dead. They and villagers stated that 4 other girls had been killed for disobedience and buried somewhere. I found nothing saying they found those bodies. A series of attacks between June 20th and 23rd resulted in 91 women and girls added to those already kidnapped. June 26th, President Jonathan signed a $1.2 million contract with a Washington, D.C. public relations firm to handle the national narrative in the media because he didn't like how he was being shown internationally. So that was important enough to spend all that money. But did they spend that much finding the girls? Who knows? Of course, this brought significant heat down on him.
As it should have.
As it should. July 1st, a bombing using a van killed 56 people in Maiduguri. July 22nd, Boko Haram launched an attack on Chibok and neighboring villages. They managed to kill about 51 villagers. 11 of those were parents of some of the missing girls. October 12th, 4 girls appeared and were taken to safety. They had been walking for 3 weeks and said they had been held in Cameroon and that they'd been raped daily. November 28th, the Central Mosque in Kano was attacked during Friday prayers. 120 were killed. In January 2015, Boko Haram kidnapped 40 boys from Malari in Borno State. The Baga massacre also occurred with 150 reported dead. This was an attack on the multinational Joint Task Force military base. Multinational. So they're just taking out everybody. In April 2015, a clergyman was able to locate the Boko Haram camps using Google Earth. He attempted to broker the release of the girls. Boko Haram sent him a video of some of the girls being raped as proof of life. They said 18 of the girls were seriously ill. The deal fell through when another group kidnapped the girls from the kidnappers making the deal. He was not the only one who had attempted to make a deal. Journalists and other groups tried at various points with no success. I have listed out a few of those, but again, I had to really cut this. In the meantime, the Nigerian military had been slowly but surely taking back the Sambisa forest, and by May, they had retaken most of the territory. They were able to rescue women held by Boko Haram, but none of these women were the Chibok girls. Another 1,000 women and girls were rescued in January 2016, but yet again, none of these were the Chibok girls. May 17th, 2016, a woman, infant, and a man were found by the Civilian Joint Task Force in the Sambisa forest, severely malnourished. That woman turned out to be Chibok girl Amina Ali Nkeke. The man said he was her husband, but he was one of the militants. And in fact, some reports stated he was a commander. So she was returned to her parents. It didn't say what happened to him. And the baby went with her. In May, President Jonathan ran for re-election on the platform #BringBackGoodLuck2015, which was a play on #BringBackOurGirls, which only enraged people more, especially considering he had been useless in bringing the girls back. He lost out to Muhammadu Buhari, and listen, I am butchering all of these, sorry, who ran a platform of eradicating Boko Haram. The Nigerian military conducted an air attack on the remaining headquarters in the Sambisa forest in August 2016. While they bragged of having killed many commanders and other militants, it would later be discovered that 10 Chibok girls had been killed in the air attack and 30 more injured. So there was, in fact, collateral damage when that sort of assault was done. And I don't know how fast a president in Nigeria takes over. So I don't know if that was under President Jonathan or President Buhari. In October 2016, 21 Chibok girls were released. One more was found later during screening of escapees from Sambisa forest. It was reported that 100 remaining girls did not want to return home, some because they feared how they would be treated due to stigma, and some because they'd been brainwashed. And just a note, of the girls who did go home, there was stigma and there were a lot of issues around that. Their families were afraid of them. They thought that they had maybe turned to Boko Haram and that they would kill them in their sleep. And it was a mess. So they weren't wrong, is what I'm saying. In 2017, 82 more girls were returned home. A ransom was paid for some of them. It was felt 112 women remain missing from the original 276 at this point. In February 2018, 110 schoolgirls were taken from Dapchi, a village near Chibok, but the West Africa branch of Islamic State, a splinter group, was the one responsible. All but one were ultimately freed. That one was the only Christian in the group they had taken. They kept her. The UN stated that a ransom was paid for their return. The government denied this. April 2018, a UNICEF report said Boko Haram has kidnapped more than 1,000 children since 2013. In 2019, President Buhari said Boko Haram was technically defeated, and then they proved him wrong. In December 2020, Boko Haram kidnapped 344 schoolboys in Kankara, but all were returned within a week. Nobody knows why. The government says they didn't pay out any money for them. I doubt that's true. Most people doubt that's true. They didn't just return almost 400 boys without a reason. In February 2021, there were 3 more mass kidnappings from schools. 42 were taken from a school in Niger, at least 27 of them students, with 1 student killed. 317 girls were taken from the girls' science secondary school in Jagebe, Zamfara State. 39 students, both male and female, were taken from the Federal College of Forestry Mechanization, AFACA, in Kaduna State. It's not clear whether these were the work of Boko Haram or other militants, as by this point, the other groups had started copying Boko Haram. There's probably good money. If $6 is enough for a human life, I assume that it's it's a good amount of money in general.
And it might be more for the boys.
Yeah, but they're returning the boys.
Ah.
I have a question. I don't know if you can answer said question. With these kidnappings, did they make their agenda clear with like some sort of ransom or threat? That's where a lot of this gets murky for my brain.
No, and you're right. It is murky. And that's the problem, is they really don't know. Now, initially, especially with the Chibok girls, they kept releasing videos, various videos, and some of those can be found online. And he would rant about whatever, like these girls should have been married, not in school. So the leader, he would have his whole thing, but they weren't necessarily asking, like, I didn't see them asking for specific amounts of money. No specific ransoms were ever given. And when the other groups started doing it, including the splinter groups off of Boko Haram, they weren't releasing videos and they weren't saying why they'd done it. So I assume that they might have contacted privately the government, but since the government wasn't putting out any information, that's impossible to find. So yeah, it's big, massive confusion. The guy, the Shekau, I think his name is, the leader of Boko Haram at the time, and he's just kind of the supposed leader, by the way, because there were so many splinter groups and just all of this that they if the government tried to work with somebody, they had no idea if they were even working with the right group that had the girls, for example, because they split them out and just gave them out and then sold them and all that good stuff. So no, there was no organized and universal message with it all. So unfortunately, while there's some idea, that's funny, good timing, of why Boko Haram commits the abductions, there's no idea about the motivations of the other groups. So it is clear that some are after payouts, and the government repeatedly said they didn't do any payouts, but that's because they didn't want the copycatting to continue, right? They didn't want it put out there, hey, we can make millions if we just keep kidnapping children. So it is shown that at least one payout occurred. It's not known beyond that if there were any others. So the parents of these abducted children, they have no faith in their government, and many act on their own. So they actually go off into the forests and look for the children on their own. I could not find, I imagine at least some of them were killed in the process of doing that, but there's no information about that. But I can't imagine going into a forest that, at least for a time, was mostly full of these militants. Turned out well for a lot of the parents that were out there trying to get their children back, but they just felt like the government wasn't doing anything, and they weren't wrong. The military was searching, but they weren't. Every time, there are so many things where I said, on this date, 80 of the girls were located. On this date, this many of the girls were located, and then nothing further was done because of the fear of collateral damage. In 2021, more girls escaped. Of those who have escaped or been rescued, many had become mothers, and all but one are now in college, reclaiming a portion of their lives. However, when one looks into their new freedom, and I'm putting that in quotes, it turns out they have been sequestered on the campus of American University of Nigeria, which is usually reserved for well-off children, the children of politicians, the children of celebrities, and they are kept on campus at all times and schooled every day but Sunday to keep them busy. Those who had children are not allowed to have their children on campus with them. It didn't say where they go, I assume to their families, because it would be just too distracting, they said. So they are now celebrities. The eyes of the world, and especially of Nigeria, are on them. They've been questioned intently, both in an attempt to find those still missing and to ensure the rescued girls haven't become loyal to Boko Haram. For the most part, they are only in touch with their families by phone, though they have been given a break to visit family once. They were allowed to go home for like a Christmas break, and I don't know if that changed after that. It's feared that they will be retargeted. They're high profile now. One rescued girl had been married before she was taken from Chibok, and she's the only one who refused to go to the college, and she was able to move back in with her husband. The girls who escaped by jumping off the trucks originally were already at college, and a lot of them had been taken to America in the interim while the other girls were missing, and felt that they had been exploited in America. There were a lot of, say, religious figures that were parading them around and using them to get money, and that money didn't go to them. They have now been placed in the same dormitory as the other rescued girls. And the thought is that they can all heal together. But also, the other students, just like the families, are uncomfortable having them at the school. They think they'll bring down an attack. They think that they may have been brought into the fold and that they will attack. So they are given therapy, and religious services are provided for both those who practice Islam and those who practice Christianity. The girls show various signs of their time with Boko Haram. They were beaten, starved, raped, and injured during various fights. Some have shrapnel. One is missing part of her leg. They've had to learn English, as that's the language spoken at the school. And so that's all their therapy, all their schooling is done in English. And so they're talking about, look how delayed they are. Well, it's because they're learning a whole new language to continue their studies. These were seniors. Technically, it would have been really easy to finish up, but since they've been having to now learn that other language and they can't talk in their own language, which is so familiar to me.
I was just going to say, gee, what does that sound like?
Of course they're delayed. So they're like, some of them are doing phonics and stuff like, yeah, in English. So I just found that frustrating. Most of them grew up speaking Hausa and other local languages.
But also on the linguistic piece of that, English is such a different language than so many other languages. I can't imagine it being easy to express yourself until you've got a certain level of mastery of that language, which can take a considerable amount of time for anybody.
Right. And from what I've heard, English is one of the harder languages to learn. So yeah, it's just, maybe they should have just been working on that. And then, because again, these were seniors taking finals. I don't feel like they needed but yeah, it's college. So I guess they've let them be graduated and be doing the college education, but it just seems like a lot. And especially when you take in what trauma can do to the brain, to everything, like it's a lot.
Hi, we're going to help you. But before we can help you, you have to learn an entire new way to express yourself.
Right? Like I get it's the American College of Nigeria, but they couldn't bring in people or therapists, especially the therapist is an American, as far as I remember from reading it. You couldn't bring in local therapists.
That seems dismissive. It seems very dismissive.
It does. Yeah. Just, they think that they're doing them a huge favor, but at the same time, they're keeping them basically imprisoned. One of them, they told a story. Her father was in a local hospital dying, and she wanted to go see them, but they had to go through this process of getting her a guard set to go with. And by the time this all got approved, they were taking her father back to the village, and he died. So she never got to see him.
So again, I don't know that you have the answer to this, but what it makes me sort of wonder if this college is sort of part of a larger conspiracy to sort of lock down some of this information and keep it from the public.
Oh yeah, the government, they have been told not to discuss. They're not allowed to discuss with media or anybody what they went through or give out any of that information. So absolutely. But again, okay, that's not from the writing, but I agree. Just to be clear. So, all right, let's see. Outside of the Chibok schoolgirls, Boko Haram has used their captives to send messages by beheading them on tape, sending them out as suicide bombers, or to be raped and married off. Some of them are sent to like barracks to just be the barracks girls to be used. However, the many girls stolen in other incidents are referred to as the forgotten girls, as their stories have never become as famous as those of the Chibok girls. The part of the reason I listed all those other things happening is we all heard about this one group of girls taken. We did not hear about the other things. Not really. And even looking for that information separate, it's all about the schoolgirls from Chibok. So only the Chibok survivors have been given the free education. No other survivors from all those other kidnappings have been given this. They actually have returned to poverty. Some are in refugee camps. Their families fear them. Like I said before, they just think they might have been radicalized. And I understand that is, we've seen it, we've seen that in America on a smaller level, these kids coming back radicalized. But the girls, there was a really good, I think it was the New York Times article, actually had a bunch of them on their pictures and some more personal stories and stuff like that. And the one thing resounding from these girls is that they're like, no, we're lucky. We're alive. We're lucky. None of them complain. There's no complaining from them about anything. So, but at the same time, are they allowed to? Who knows? But just the mentality that comes across when they do talk about the little they're allowed to talk about is just very much strong. They want to move on. So hopefully they'll be allowed to, because my concern is what happens when they're done with college.
Yeah.
And if they're holding them back in the ways they're holding them back, how long are they going to be at this college? But since this really just started in 2021 for some of them, it's going to be a while before we know. Other than abductions, there are ongoing bombings, with child-related suicide bombings increasing at an alarming rate. Attacks occur on various officials, mosques, churches, and even farmers were attacked in 2021. Like a group of farmers were taken out. Though there weren't easily searchable attacks listed for 2022, the rate of attacks indicates they're still actively happening now, and it has spread into the countries of Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, which surround Nigeria. Benin is on the other side, on the west, and because all of this is really happening in the northeast, it hasn't hit them the same. So a lot of Nigerians have fled to their bordering countries as well, trying to get away from the violence there. It's just, we all kind of know this stuff is going on, I feel like, right? Like we all know, but it's just, I don't feel like we understand the level.
Yeah, the depth.
Because Nigeria, clearly they have these colleges. In general, the belief is that there should be an education, and they're trying and they're providing it. But then they have so many militant groups that are making this hard. And I'm sure this is just one small area. Probably if I'd looked, there's stuff happening in other parts by different groups and all of that stuff, but it would have taken a lot.
It would have been a very long podcast.
Yeah, they were talking about the freedom, and it's just like, I don't feel like those girls are free now. So again, we'll see how that goes.
No, it seems like there's such a larger story to be told, and that they're not free to tell that story yet.
Yeah.
But they're really limited in their resources to be able to
Absolutely
not only move forward, but own that experience.
Yeah. And if their families fear them, they're not getting any help from that end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how much even is happening there. They're kind of orphaned. And I'm sure that's not all of them. I'm sure there are family members who are backing them and all of that stuff. But what can they do? What can those family members do about anything? I don't think they have the power to do anything. I'm surprised the one was allowed to go back to her husband, except that maybe they felt like that was an ownership thing. So she could go back to him. He owned her, right? Like, it's just, So anyway, you have something to talk about that is going to be very interesting, and you have a couple angles on it.
I do, and I do hope it's interesting, but I'm going to start with my personal experience. And I'm very into sort of how the universe pushes ideas towards people, and sort of the spiritual aspect of not only creativity, but the spiritual aspect of living. I embrace a lot of mysticism and ideas. So some of it may be a little woo-woo. There's always that moment I'll steal from Shamalama Ding Dong, M. Night Shyamalan, who I love making fun of his name. But he, in a movie, I believe Signs, talked about how when there's coincidences, do you think they're just a coincidence, or do you feel there's something larger and cosmic happening? I tend to err on the side of more cosmic. That said, I don't believe everything happens for a reason. Sometimes bad things happen because they just happen, and it's nobody's fault. You weren't meant to learn anything from it. Sometimes shitty things just happen to good people.
Because humanity.
Exactly. Like a lot of the folks we're going to talk about in this specific case. So in the summer of 2018, I left Colorado Springs to start a new job in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we rented a house on the West Mesa of Albuquerque and moved. And it was an interesting house, and, got settled, and I started a job at a local TV station. And I had kind of an odd experience one day. I woke up and I went to the bathroom that was connected to our bedroom in the house, and I heard something in the shower, and I opened the shower curtain and I saw a girl standing in the bathtub, and she was trying to talk to me, but I was having a really hard time hearing her, and I could only hear a few things. She was whispering really softly, and she was telling me about her family and her grandmother, and one grandmother spoke Spanish only and one spoke English only, but she wanted to show me something, and she pointed, and I looked the direction she pointed, and the house was gone, and I just saw complete empty desert in the area where my house that we were living in was. And then I saw, almost like a time lapse, some different things and some different construction and things happening in that area. And at some point during this, I realized it was kind of like a lucid dream, that I must have been dreaming, that this was clearly not necessarily happening in my bathroom. So I decided to go back to my bed to go back to sleep. And then I woke up and went to go make coffee, and I saw a lizard in the kitchen. So I went to open the door to let the lizard out, and then I saw another lizard come and eat that lizard. And then the bigger lizard came into the house.
Oh.
And larger lizard vomited up smaller lizard, which took off running.
Yeah.
And I was like, so I think I'm still dreaming. So went back to my body to come back. And it was the start of a series of really strange lucid dreams that I was having in this house. And at the time, I didn't know a lot about true crime or things that were happening in Albuquerque. I had not done much research, but someone I worked with had mentioned one point the West Mesa murders, and I hadn't really looked into them very much. But that day when I went to work, it happened to be the anniversary of the date that the first bone on the West Mesa was found by a woman walking her dog.
Ugh.
That bone turned out to be a femur, and started just sort of a whole snowball effect of finding murders that had taken place and bodies that were buried on the West Mesa in Albuquerque. So it's sort of a strange coincidence. And at that point, I started doing some research because I was sort of interested and wondering why this was compelling, and why the things that were happening at the time they were, and why it sort of spoke to me. It was around the anniversary of the date of the first bone being found. I happened to run into more information at my job around the West Mesa murders at that point. And then I had talked to a really interesting woman about African culture. We were interviewing for a show on the station, and she had mentioned something to me that I found really kind of fascinating, that in her culture, a lot of people's spirits basically reside on their face.
Okay.
And I thought that was a really interesting concept. She is of African-American descent. And that sort of stuck with me. And as I was thinking about these women, and I started to look them up, it really didn't all click till I started to see their faces. And it sort of led me down this journey into looking into this crime and seeing what had happened. And the story is still unsolved, which is so incredibly shocking for an amount of people to be found at this site and for there to be no official resolution. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about my research into it, which comes from a few places. Obviously, Wikipedia was my first lookup of the murders. Then the Albuquerque Journal was a big one. I did read a lot of those articles for research. They also supplied maps. And as I started to look at the maps, I found the site of the West Mesa murder burials, I call them the West Mesa Bone Collector, were adjacent to the housing development I was living in, which I found kind of fascinating.
And so what were there houses where they were being found, or was that pretty much open field? Or
it was pretty much open desert at that point.
Okay.
And then the other sources I want to name are Dateline NBC, which has come up a couple times this week. And allthat'sinteresting.com. So I started to do some research, and in essence, starting on February 2nd, 2009, a woman walking her dog had found this bone. She called her sister, who was a nurse, and showed her a picture she'd taken with her phone. And the sister said, "That's definitely human. You should call the police." And when the police came out to check and excavate, they found the remains of a woman. And this is where a lot of it gets really sort of fascinating to me. There was a woman at the police department named Ida Lopez, a detective who had been working a lot of cases of missing women. And she had always sort of had this hunch that a lot of the women on her list would be found together. And as they started excavating and finding more and more women on this site, it turned out that several of the women were on the list that Ida had been trying to find. And her diligence in spending time talking to the families and getting to know the kind of the contacts and families and stories of a lot of these women that had gone missing led to her getting DNA information and dental records and things that helped identify the bodies of many of these women, which was amazingly chilling. So the murders happened in essence between about 2001 and 2005, and ultimately 11 women were buried in this, they call it an arroyo bank, where a wash had been on the west side of Albuquerque. And a lot of things sort of came together. Whomever was taking them out there obviously knew the area, and there were housing developments going up in a sort of adjacent place. But this had been a new area that was going to be developed, but hadn't been fully developed yet. And at the time that the first bone was found by the gal, I think her name was Christine, walking the dog, the area had been sort of leveled off to build a new community that ended up becoming abandoned when the housing bubble sort of burst.
Oh.
And then through a series of sort of weather events and a flood, some things began to appear in the sand, and this whole excavation started to take place. So 11 women and a fetus were discovered in this burial site. So lots of folks, and there were not a ton of leads, mainly because a lot of people were claiming some had not been reported missing, but the reality is a lot of them were missing, and Ida Lopez had been looking for them, but nobody seemed to know. And a lot of the women had different challenges and were sex workers, and some of them had some drug issues. And I think because of that, it became really hard to find people in those communities who were willing to talk about their friends or what had happened or what they had seen.
That makes sense. And also maybe they were reported missing and it was one of those things where they're like, yeah, this is a grown adult. They probably just went somewhere, which is what we run into all the time with these stories. And so they don't get listed as missing, even though the families did try to.
So we have one detective working to find these women and find where they come from. And a shocking number of them had been on Ida's list. But as they continued to search, there was one woman who was not from Albuquerque, and she was also African-American, which didn't fit the profile of the other women who had been killed, who had come to Albuquerque via Denver, essentially. And it sort of threw things off because everyone assumed it was a local person taking local girls. And this girl was particularly young. She was only about 15 years old. Her name was Sylvania Edwards. And in addition to her bones, they found part of her weave and her pink acrylic nail, which there's all these weird little touches that I find kind of sort of fascinating in what survives and what gets excavated over the course of these cases. And based on dental records, they were able to identify her. But this sort of changed everything because she was just so different than any of the other folks found there. It began to open this idea of, were these burials, were people taken there from other places? If not everybody was killed in Albuquerque, had she been killed in Albuquerque and brought there? Or was there maybe a larger syndicate or prostitution ring or sex trafficking ring that might be attached to this crime?
Were there enough similarities that it couldn't have just been a fluke that somebody just happened to also dump this woman's body there?
I think that's one idea. There's also this idea that there's probably other bodies out there that houses are either built over or were never found, or the women who were not resolved missing from Ida's initial list, maybe, could be other places, but it just keeps getting weirder from there. Then there's two nobody ever really officially names a suspect, but one of the folks who was pretty close to being a suspect, a guy named Lorenzo Montoya, in 2006, was trying to strangle a woman in a trailer just a few miles from the West Mesa site. He did end up killing her, and her boyfriend shot him. Oh. So the police got no information from him, so that suspect was gone. And then at one point in about 2010, another suspect from Joplin, Missouri, had been sighted in the area taking photographs of a lot of the transient folks on what people call in Albuquerque the war zone. And he had been in for the balloon fiesta, and he was a photographer, and he had a lot of incriminating photos, and people thought he might be connected, but then he ended up being taken off the list as a suspect at one point. And then in 2015, another person who was already incarcerated named Joseph Blia, he was already incarcerated for the kidnapping and then killing of a sex worker, claimed in prison to his prison cellmate that he knew several of the women that had been killed and found on the West Mesa, but he's already in prison. And there was also some rumblings about whether or not killer Scott Lee Kimball from Colorado might be related. But right now, there's no official resolution. It's still considered an open case.
Do they seem to favor any of the suspects, or are they just seem like all piddly suspects?
The hardest thing about this seems to be that there's not a lot of direct links to all of the victims. And in all of the aerial photography, one of the keys to the case was aerial photography that had been taken at different times. They were able to map and determine when people were buried, because you have this vast desert and you see these sort of grave sites. But they were all done so similarly, there had to be a connection with these 11 women. And nobody can seem to connect all of them to one perpetrator.
Were the causes of death strangulation?
This is the other thing. The police department won't release the cause of death. And I don't know if they don't know from all of them because of deterioration or the amount of time that they were there, or that they're sort of keeping that close to the vest, because in combination of getting a lot of copycat murders and a lot of strange confessions that aren't true, there was a real challenge getting attention on the women initially that were just missing. But once the grave sites started to get unearthed, the media frenzy became problematic insofar as reporting details of the case, which prompted a lot of false confessions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, though. It's crazy how many false confessions come in for stuff. And it's like, on the one hand, they should be prosecuted for that, but on the other, that would cost a fortune because there's so many. Mm-hmm. It would be such a waste of court time, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So you have to keep stuff back so that the person comes in and says, well, I killed them all with the ball-peen hammer. They can be like, no, you didn't.
But it still remains one of the most notorious cold cases here in New Mexico. And there's a sort of a split. Some of the investigators think that whomever did this moved on and is doing it in other communities. Mm-hmm. Some people think it may have been, a combo effort of a couple of suspects. Obviously one of them's dead and one is incarcerated. But just because there's no connection to current murders in this area doesn't mean whomever did this isn't still working or part of a network of something larger when it comes to the murdering of women, especially women who are living on the fringes of society.
Mm-hmm.
They're easy targets.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And it's heartbreaking on so many levels that you have this detective, Ida Lopez, and she's got this list that she's working of missing women, and she's doing her best to find them. And so many of the women that were found in these graves ended up being on her list. And maybe something could have happened sooner to stop him if more resources were able to be given to finding them initially.
Do you have any idea how big her list is at this point? Are we talking tens of names, hundreds?
I think at the time she was working, I think it was about 17. It was somewhere between 15 and 20 girls that had been reported missing. And I believe a good chunk of them came off of her list. And then there were a couple of kind of wild cards, which sort of begs a question of, in those communities, in the communities of folks living on the fringe, are they moving between cities? And are they doing that of their own volition? Or are they being trafficked in some sense by another organization?
Yeah, there's so much that it could be. That's it.
And then
the transient population is so hard to figure that out with. That's how they get away with stuff for so long, though. Not somebody who's feeding on them, that's how they get away with it. Because you don't know if they've just traveled or if they've been,
And then I don't know if there's ever been a clear motive around the murder. Were they just being murdered as, for lack of a better term, a crime of opportunity? Or were they trying to coerce them into something that they wouldn't agree to? Or were they maybe working for someone and decided they wanted to separate or sever that relationship and were killed as a result? There's not a lot of information on who was hunting these women and why, which is very unsettling.
It is.
Yeah.
Anything like that. And just like you said, there could be more bodies in that area and it just hasn't been found, and they won't if there have been houses built over that. So that's not going to happen. Ground penetrating radar only works so well, and it costs thousands of dollars for a small area. So that's never realistic in a police budget, right? There's so many things.
Yeah. And it's not practical to just say, well, we have this whole big area there might be bodies in, whereas it's more practical if you could target where you want to search.
Yeah. So there could be stuff turning up for ages.
For sure. And then, like with any crime that's reported, there's probably dozens that aren't. And for every girl that was reported missing, there's probably at least 3 or 4 that were not reported. And it's terrifying at some level to think that these things are happening in plain sight, and that these burial sites, that communal burial sites, even exist in the first place. So hopefully, as it's now the 13th anniversary, I believe, of finding them, there'll be a little bit more attention because someone's got to know something somewhere.
Yeah. And there's it seems like there's so much space when they started building there, or whatever the situation is, then they might've just moved it all somewhere else. There's so many places it could be that are barren, or, there just aren't people living around. So scary.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And it's so sad. We talked about your story with the girls and these girls, how many women meet these ends and then there's no resolution for the families or justice for what happened to them. And these crimes continue.
Yeah. Well, I covered the femicides in Ciudad Juarez in a past, and it's just as many bodies as they've found. It's probably barely scratching the surface on that too. It's the situation. That's why there's organizations, international and national and all of that, who try and work with this, but it's impossible. It's like digging a tiny hole in the desert or anything like that. And just, all right, here's our 1 acre of space out of all of the open space anywhere. There's just so much going on that we have no idea about yet.
There is. And I have to believe that whomever chose that site had some connection with the area or construction or something to know what to do and know where to place it and see what was happening. and maybe it was observational, maybe it was somebody who worked in that industry. There was one sort of strange thing where a tag from a tree nursery was found in the area that was also connected to where the suspect from 2015 that's incarcerated, that he frequented. So I do wonder if there's some sort of construction, landscaping, some sort of connection there. Also, if maybe the disposal was done separately than the murder by, I don't know if you would call them contracted, but there was some sort of larger thing happening where folks were hiding evidence on behalf of others that were killing.
Interesting.
Well, that's a whole other, that's a whole different corridor to go down, and it's got its own set of doors leading off of there.
It's an interesting concept.
It is.
Well, thank you.
A lot more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But it's strange that something could go that long with that many victims without having any resolution.
It really does. That's a lot. And again, possibly just the tip of the iceberg. So it could be a lot bigger even than we think at this point.
So when I found out what you were going to be talking about today, it got me. I don't even know how I stumbled across this because it deserves to have a lot more attention than it has gotten. But dealing with the family members and the women and the children who aren't talked about when they go missing. So what I'm going to talk about is actually I'm going to talk about an organization, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about what has inspired them. It's an organization called Black and Missing. Have you ever heard of them?
No.
Because I had not either.
I've never heard of them. I'm writing it down.
So Derica Wilson is a native of Spartanburg, South Carolina. She's got 20 years experience in law enforcement. She and her sister-in-law, Natalie Wilson, who has her experience is in public relations and social media. So in 2008, these two women founded the Black and Missing Foundation Incorporated, which is a 501c3 organization. And here I'm going to just read a quote straight from the website, whose mission is to bring awareness to missing persons of color, provide vital resources and tools to missing persons, families, and friends, and to educate the minority community on personal safety. Yeah. The fact that we have to have this is what's astonishing to me. So one of the first things, not that they were unaware of this, especially the one working in law enforcement, but the case that really caught their attention, and I will explain why, was a 24-year-old named Tamika Houston, who was a Black woman and a nursing student who was reported missing in May of 2004. She went missing from her home, leaving behind her beloved and pregnant dog. And if you're a dog person, you get it. Yeah. Some people are you're attached to your dog. She would not have just walked off and left an expectant dog anyway. But here's the thing. She was 24 years old.
How old was she? No.
Apparently my lips aren't working today. I'm not sure why. She was a student. She was working as a waitress, and she was a homeowner. But her case got zero media attention. This was not a person who was apt to run away. So despite authorities finding her abandoned car by the side of the road, still no attention. In 2006, so it was 2 full years later, her boyfriend admitted to killing her during an argument and led authorities to where he buried her remains. What was happening when she went missing? As soon as I mentioned what was happening, you're going to go, oh yeah, that. Does the name Jennifer Wilbanks mean anything to either of you?
Vaguely.
Okay. She ran away so she wouldn't have to marry her fiance. She was the runaway bride.
Ooh.
She was cute. She was brunette. She was white. She didn't return home from her evening jog on April 26th. On April 28th, the police declared it a criminal investigation. And on April 29th, she called her fiance, claiming she'd been kidnapped and raped by an Hispanic man and a white woman who had just released her. That was a complete lie. But she had run away. She had literally run away. But 2 days, she didn't return from her evening jog. And in 2 days, it was a criminal investigation. So people have asked, did it get more press because she came from a wealthier family? Because it was the wedding that she ran away from, there were 600 guests invited. I can't even imagine.
Yuck.
And here's the thing that almost made me fall out of my chair: 28 bridesmaids.
Good Lord.
Where do you find 28 people to wear a bridesmaid's dress? I mean,
Or, I don't know.
I can't even. 28 bridesmaids. That seems excessive. So, so the question was it because of socioeconomic status, or was it because she
feel
got the
like-
press because she was a white girl?
Well, I also feel like it was an unusual situation, and a person going missing isn't. Like a person going missing.
But they declared her missing immediately.
So the press she got was while she was missing, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah. The press that she got after she was found is continuous.
Astronomical, but
Yes.
she got it before.
But she got it as soon as she didn't come home. It was a big fat fucking deal.
Ugh.
So now, don't get me wrong. When somebody comes up missing, yes, it is a big fat hairy deal.
Yeah, but it's been demonstrated repeatedly that not everybody
Exactly.
goes missing gets that attention.
So there are some statistics. Oh, and I didn't even give you my sources, but I fact checked everything on this. So from the Black and Missing website, which I verified because I'm that way, from the FBI website, in 2020, 543,018 people were reported missing. 59% were white, which includes Hispanic, and 37% were minority. So 37% were Black, Asian, and Indigenous.
Okay.
Which is a huge, people are like, well, okay. No. Black people make up 13% of our country's population, but 37% of the missing.
Right.
That's a big disparity.
Indigenous are like 1.6% of the population. Something
So-
crazy like that. Don't quote me.
Okay. So a lot of the time, so here's what happens. When a minority child goes missing, they are reported as a runaway. If they are reported as a runaway, there is no Amber Alert issued. The FBI doesn't get involved. It's a whole different mechanism if they're considered a runaway than if they're considered missing.
Right.
So missing adults are often classified as criminals, or it's assumed that they were involved in drug or gang activities.
So I will say though that there have been laws, at least in various places, that make it so that if they are considered missing and at risk in any way, they still treat it as missing, even if they think that it might be that. And that law changed because of some of the
Yes,
stuff. that's turned out.
different. We just talked about one,
Yes.
didn't we? I can't remember which one, but yeah, that became a law because of them.
I think it was Brandon Swanson, but I could be wrong. But I did.
That might have been.
And he was a white male, but he was treated at first. The police were like,
Yeah.
whatever, he's partying. So what?
Yeah, and that's right. It was the guy. Yes, I remember. It comes back to me now. But yeah, you can't assume if they're poor and people of color in a bad neighborhood and they go missing, it's just assumed, well, they live in a bad neighborhood. They're a victim of crime. There's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
It's desensitization. And they actually list that as why this is happening. It's the desensitization of the general population and places like news outlets who have a predominantly white newsroom or a predominantly white staff. So that's the stories that they're focusing on.
Right. I will say though that it happens a lot with just poor communities, whether
Yes.
no matter what their color is.
That is true. So
Now the gal that went missing that inspired this group, what was her name? Tamika?
hold on. Yes, Tamika Houston.
Did her family reported her? They followed up. They were looking and got no help. Is that essentially what was?
That's essentially what happens.
Well, and it was her husband that killed her ultimately.
Boyfriend. I think.
Boyfriend?
Okay. So what if she wasn't,
Fiance. No, boyfriend. Sorry.
were they living together? It may not have said.
I don't think so, but I'm not
Okay.
sure. To me, this is a fascinating phenomena. It is fascinating to me and inspiring what these two women have done, that they've come together and built this organization. And I will talk more about the organization itself at the end. HBO, anybody who is interested, HBO recently released a 4-part documentary about this organization. And they highlighted some of the cases. I mean, one of their board members, it took him 8 years to get justice for his sister. His sister just went missing. And it was the same thing. This was someone who was employed and was active and connected to her family and her community. And she went missing. And the police were kind of like, well, what do you want us to do? So and again, it was the male she was involved with. I can't remember in that case. It so often is. So this HBO special, this documentary series talks about some of the cases that they've been involved with. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. There was Akia Eggleston of Baltimore, Maryland, who went missing when she didn't show up for her baby shower.
That's crazy.
And a prenatal doctor's appointment. And her family had to work so hard to keep this in the news, to keep people looking, to keep people's eyes on it. So that was in May of 2017. In February of this year, it's like 2 months ago, Michael Robertson, the father of her unborn child, was finally arrested for her murder.
Lord.
That's like a quick resolution.
Yeah.
It is. And I don't know if you've touched on this much in other podcasts, but aren't pregnant women in a higher category of potentially being murdered by partners than
I don't know.
and others?
Good question.
I read an article. I think it was called,
Like-
I'll look it up and I'll send it to you guys, but I think it was talking about pregnant women being an endangered species, that it's very common for pregnant women to be killed by partners.
Interesting. Because I could see that. I know that happens a lot with, say, affairs and pregnancy, right?
Mhm.
Because they don't want to have to deal with it. And then if you weren't married or whatever, if you weren't already in that committed relationship, I could see it happening there a lot. So it actually makes a lot of sense.
And you're very vulnerable when you're pregnant. You can't defend yourself as well.
Yeah.
Depending on how far along you are, just because of the physicality of pregnancy, you're off balance. You're
Right.
You're you might be weaker. You're fucking cranky, but but that would make you more able. But it's anyway.
Yeah.
One of the other ones they talked about was Keisha Jacobs. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. From Richmond, Virginia. She went to a friend's house on September 26th of 2016. Texted her mother to say, made it here safely. I'll see you tomorrow. It's the last communication her mother ever had with her. Her cell phone has never been used since that time. Her bank accounts haven't been touched, but it's been an uphill battle to convince authorities that her daughter was missing, that her daughter didn't just run away. She tried to get the FBI involved and they just wouldn't even talk to her.
If you run away, you're usually going to need money from your account.
And you
to
take
do
your phone with you.
Yeah.
She agreed to appear in the documentary because she's hoping there are no leads, absolutely nothing, absolutely zero. And somebody somewhere had to have seen something, but she's hoping that this is going to help her daughter's case, help somebody come forward who has seen something, because outside of Richmond, nobody's talking about this case.
Right.
And the last one that I'm going to talk about is, to me, the most horrific one, because it's Relisha Rudd, who's an 8-year-old girl. And I know, the expression, she fell through the cracks. She didn't fall through the cracks. She was yanked through the cracks. And this happened in DC. And they think because her circumstances were so rough, it didn't get any attention. What happened was she was living with her mother in a shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So they were already disadvantaged. They were befriended by a janitor, Khalil Tatum, who was a former felon who had been in prison for 10 years and then for 7 years before he was hired as a janitor for the shelter. He was known for improperly fraternizing with the shelter residents and particularly for paying too much attention to young girls.
Ugh.
Yep. So when Relisha stopped going to school in February of 2014, her mother sent a note to the school saying Her daughter was ill and was under the care of a Dr. Tatum. And she provided a phone number. So the school reached out and made an appointment with this man. And when he didn't show up, they contacted the police and reported the girl as missing.
I have to say that's good follow through for the school.
It is, but she was missing for a month before they reported it. Now I get it. I see both sides of it, but it took a whole month of her not being there.
How far out was the appointments that
I don't know.
that was obviously a delaying tactic for.
Yes, but that seemed to be a shorter period of time. She had been missing, I think, for 18 days before they started to go, hey, where is she?
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a month later when they started the investigation. They found video. Now, I will say the police were able to find video from 2 separate hotels from the hallways, one on February 26th and one on March 1st, showing Relisha going into a room with Tatum. On March 20th, the day after the search began, Tatum's wife was found shot to death in a motel in Maryland. And on March 31st, Tatum's body was found in a shed, dead of what appeared to be a suicide. He was killed with the same gun that killed his wife. But nobody knows what happens to Relisha. Nobody knows. Nobody's talking about it. It just sort of like it. They don't know. They don't have. They're like, well, what can we do? And the big fear in this case is that the little girl is dead.
She most likely is. Yeah.
But the thing
statistically,
but nobody's talking about it. Her face isn't big. So let me put it this way. How many pictures did we see in the news of JonBenét Ramsey?
Jesus. How many do we still see? How many articles do we still see about JonBenét? As a Coloradan, I got tired of that a long time ago.
We may have seen a tiny bit more of it because of being in Colorado. Yeah. But, it's...
Yeah, but if we say that name to anybody, they know exactly who we're talking about, whether they live here or not.
So what Black and Missing is doing is, first of all, they have a huge database of missing persons. They have an anonymous tip line set up. So if anyone thinks they've spotted someone who's missing, they can call it in. They have resources, tools, and advice for anyone who has a family member gone missing. They have a checklist. This was just astonishing to me. They have a checklist of what actions to take if a loved one goes missing.
A good idea.
A template you can download for missing persons flyer, and tips and advice for preventing abductions and keeping your children safe. And I will say one other thing to their credit. You have to file a police report before you file with them.
Okay, so they're just making sure that you've actually done your due diligence.
Yes, that this is a missing person, that you're not acting out in some bizarre way. One thing they do or they don't do is they don't sit around and wait for the local news cycle to decide if the story is worthy. The woman who is the public relations specialist, they advocate for and assist in getting rapid deployment of social media. So they are helping people get the news out, get the word out immediately, get the pictures out, get the word out. This is our sister. We haven't seen her. This is our son. This is our daughter. This is what she looks like. Here's where we saw her last. We haven't seen her. Getting it out immediately.
Yeah, social media can be great for that, but we also know how hard it can be to get people to share stuff out.
Oh, yes. They also have links to all kinds of online resources, national organizations, databases, helplines, shit I had never even heard of. I didn't even know existed. When this episode airs, which will be on April 20th, I'll provide a link to the Black and Missing website as well as to the HBO documentary.
And this makes me think that it wouldn't hurt for us to have a page where we list resources like Black and Missing and the resources for MMIW and stuff like that.
Oh,
so we should really get on that. But do a shout out to the people who created this organization again.
Their names are Derica and Natalie Wilson.
Okay.
They are
this sounds like
sisters-in-law.
an amazing site, like an amazing resource.
Yeah, exactly. These are the people you want on your side.
They've done their work.
And there's a lot of personal statements on the website. Thank you so much. Because of you, my daughter is home. Or because of you, I know what happened to my daughter.
Yeah. Just
a very quick mention. Women are not the only ones who go missing, and little girls are not the only ones who are taken. But out of the media attention they get, it does mostly go to women.
That's true. That's yeah.
Yeah. Which for adults is one thing, but for missing children too.
And you think that missing children's cases, a 7-year-old or whatever,
Yeah.
That those would get more news. Just because I get why missing adults can be overlooked.
Mhm.
I get the rationale. I don't like it. I get the rationale though. This is a grown ass adult and they could have done whatever they wanted to because they have that capability. But kids don't. And if you're a kid and you're not murdered,
Yeah.
then you're living on the street somewhere, and that's bad as well.
And if you're living on the streets, it's not long before you're in the sex industry.
Victimized in about a billion different ways.
Yep.
So I don't ever get why those aren't put out there more.
It's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate that, you know, for a while there was a few TV shows dedicated specifically to the missing. And I would hope with a lot of the interest in true crime that more of that will come to light.
Yeah, it seems to have worked that way for some things. I mean,
Yeah.
Did anybody know about missing and murdered Indigenous women a few years ago? Not so much, but it gets mentioned a bit more and it gets out there some more. And I think that people have really tried to bring attention to the fact that if a minority goes missing, nobody gives a shit, you know?
And I think too, as the computer networks develop, police departments are sharing information more.
Yes, and that's a huge part of the problem. Also, medical facilities not being on any
Yes.
sort of connected in any way, because there's so much stuff that could probably be tied together if medical facilities communicated.
Mhm.
And if police had access, for example, to get information, do a search, whatever, on somebody who turns up at a hospital a state away, which could be
Yes.
related to something. There's a lot of stuff that is problematic because of how we're set up. States are basically countries in some ways, right? You know, so
They are.
you never notice that quite so much as when you're talking about true crime, I think.
Yeah, how the laws differ from state to state. from
And
place to
schools
place.
communicating and social services communicating nationally, you know, but
Oh,
so
yeah, 100%. And different entities of law enforcement. When the FBI comes in, a lot of times the local police get miffed and people
Mhm.
don't share enough. You'd think with all the technology we have, we would be more connected in the right ways.
yes. And there should never, ever be egos involved when you're trying to find somebody or
Mhm.
solve a crime. There just shouldn't. Should never be how that works. All right. Wow. Those are some dark and dismal
Yes.
topics right there.
Yes, and for the people listening, you couldn't see me waving my arms around as I talked.
Gesticulating.
Just yes, like
But yeah, it's frustrating. And so what was the victim profile of the West Mesa, was it?
Of the West Mesa murders, most of the women were in their between, you know, the youngest was 15, but they were mostly in their 20s. One was 32, was the oldest. A lot of them were Hispanic and had some sort of disenfranchised situation where they had been either seen in some rough areas, maybe had some drug problems. People who had reported them missing were having challenges in those relationships, keeping tabs on them. And that part was really tough. One of the fathers of one of the victims, Michelle Valdez, her father really helped get a lot of the families together and helped really kind of organize a group where they could all talk to each other and support each other and talk about those girls' lives before they were murdered and before things sort of went south for them, when they had, you know, hopes and dreams and what their lives were like, and that they were really human beings, not just statistics.
mhm.
Yeah. It's amazing how hard some families have to fight just to get the case out there and get people listening to it and actually looking into it. So yeah, it's stressful. It's sad. It's dismal. It's upsetting. It's angering. So many emotions,
Mhm.
but we really appreciate you coming on and bringing attention to the West Mesa murders. And it reminded me of your story, by the way, about the girl in the bath and everything. When I was a teenager, the house I lived in, I had friends from that didn't know each other. For example, I had a friend who'd moved here from Maryland before I moved here. And then her dad and my dad actually ended up at the same company, even though they hadn't started that way in Maryland. And every time I had sleepovers, I had multiple friends that had the same dreams about the same little girl in this closet. I had a toy closet because I was down in the basement, and the basement was also where the kids got to play all day because I'm almost a 5. And they were having the same dreams about a little girl on some sort of a little stuffed mattress. And they would go into the closet because she would beckon them in there, but then it would turn into prairie. Because of course, here we live in Colorado, and it would be this little wooden house and everything. And I had dreams about it, but I hadn't told anybody because I had a lot of dreams. So if I told everybody about all my dreams, because I'm a person who remembers their dreams. But yeah, it was really weird. One told me, and then another one told me a while after she'd stayed at the house, and she didn't know the person who'd had the dream before. And it was just, I always wanted to try and find out, but it's really hard. How do you find if there was a house there back in like pioneer days? Because that's how they described her, as being dressed, and that's how I saw her. So just seeing something like that, and her mouth would move, but nobody could ever hear her. I could never hear her. They never heard her. It was weird. So it just made me think of that whole paranormal experience. But that house was like mad haunted. So I don't know why. It wasn't an old house.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because the house that I was in prior to the one I'm in now was built around 2000, and there was a lot of activity in that bathroom. I had a light fixture explode one day. Bill and I were having coffee and heard a bang, and we're walking around the house trying to figure out what it was, and a light fixture just spontaneously exploded in that room, and there was shards of glass everywhere. But there was a lot of weird kind of activity in that house, and it was a younger house in terms of, I've lived in houses that are hundreds of years old.
Oh yeah.
But there was sort of something connected, and I've always, again, on the woo-woo thing, felt that either family members or somebody was trying to connect with one of these girls, and then somehow it siphoned through where I was at that time for whatever reason. But I felt like somebody was reaching out. There was too many coincidences with dates and sort of images, and it was really kind of a haunting thing. And I hope ultimately, it does get resolved, and whomever did this pays, and the memories of these girls are preserved. But it's to me, there's a lot happening in the universe, and sometimes you just get glimpses of things.
And did you say that there's a memorial to at least the girls they've identified there now? Okay, good. I mean, a memorial doesn't do a lot, but it keeps them alive in a way. It keeps that memory alive.
Yeah, there's been some dedications and places for people to do that. And also some of the folks were able to then bury family members too, which is, I think, a big part of the grieving process for a family to have that opportunity, because so many people never get that.
No.
To know what happened.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know that they know that they're gone, but
right. But even to know,
to not be left not knowing if that person's alive or dead can be very
terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terrible stuff. Thank you, Sue, for coming on today. Thank you to our listeners. Just so you guys know, we now have, if anybody's heard of Buy Me a Coffee, it's just a way that people can contribute to the show if they listen. And so we're at buymeacoffee.com/MM Mayhem. And the M's are capital. I don't think that'll matter, but just in case. So thank you guys. And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
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 Thank you for listening to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
Find us on Facebook and Instagram, or at our website, mysteriesmonstersmayhem.com.
Please like, rate, and review, follow, and share wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.
Thank you for listening and supporting our podcast. We'll be back next week with more shenanigans.